wasn't supposed to wear the crown. He wasn't supposed to live long enough to even touch it. Born a bastard, branded by sin before he could speak, Manfred entered the world as an accident, the unwanted echo of an emperor's lust. But from the moment he opened his eyes, he carried something heavier than bloodline, the weight of a collapsing empire. Behind him loomed the ghost of his father, Frederick II, a man feared by popes, worshipped by scholars, and hated by God's own court. In front of him only knives. They say Manfred was beautiful. Silver gold hair, a mind sharper than steel, a smile that could disarm armies. But beauty in his world was a curse. It distracted, it disarmed, it made you forget he was dangerous. Because beneath the silk, Manfred was hungry, not for gold, not for peace, but for a throne that would never truly be his. He took it anyway, and the world recoiled. The church damned him. Kings despised him. Even the sky seemed to turn its face, but Manfred didn't kneel. He ruled with a mask of serenity and a soul stitched together by defiance. And when death came for him, it wasn't quiet, it was savage. His crown was shattered. His bones left in the dirt. His name buried beneath lies, silence, and holy vengeance. But before that day, before the final charge, the betrayal, the blood in the dust, there was a child, uncrowned, unloved, unwelcome. And his name was Manfred. He was born without a right to rule, and yet the shadows whispered he would. Manfred came into the world in 1232, the illegitimate son of Emperor Frederick II, the most feared and controversial ruler in Europe. His mother was a noblewoman, but not a queen. His birth brought no cheers, no bells, no anointment, only a nod from a father too busy shaping empires to acknowledge another mistake. And yet, that mistake had fire in his blood. Manfred grew up in the imperial court, surrounded by contradictions, Arabic philosophers and Catholic priests, crusaders and heretics, assassins and poets. Frederick Sicily was a kingdom of mirrors and masks, and Manfred learned early how to wear both. He wasn't raised to inherit, he was raised to survive. Other princes sharpened their Latin, Manfred sharpened silence. He watched, he listened, he learned how to disappear in plain sight. But somewhere deep inside, beyond the courtly manners and golden boy charm, something darker stirred. A hunger, a resentment, a sense that the world would never offer him a throne, so he would have to take it. They said he looked like a statue carved by angels, but there was always something unnatural behind his eyes. Too calm, too still. He didn't cry when others cried. He didn't flinch when others knelt. He walked with the grace of someone who had already imagined every death in the room, including his own. And even as a child, he saw how fragile power truly was. His father, the emperor of half the Christian world, was already being hunted by popes and whispered about in pulpits. The church called Frederick the Antichrist. What then did that make his bastard son? Manfred was not born into power. He was born beneath it, forced to study its cracks, its weaknesses, its rot. And as he grew, he understood something most kings never do, that crowns are not given, they are stolen. But before he could claim one, he would have to watch the world around him fall to pieces. It began, as all great collapses do, with the death of a father. Power doesn't die quietly, especially when it believes itself eternal. When Emperor Frederick II finally collapsed in 1250, The earth didn't shake, but the world trembled. One man's breath had held together an empire, the Holy Roman Crown, the Kingdom of Sicily, the fragile web of vassals and enemies held at bay by sheer force of will. And now that breath was gone. What followed wasn't succession, it was decay. Frederick's legitimate heir Conrad was still alive, but he was far away in Germany, surrounded by wolves, too young, too foreign, too late. In Sicily, chaos surged like rot under marble. Nobles turned on each other. The Pope circled like a vulture in priest's robes, demanding the crown be stripped from Hohenstaufen hands. And in the middle of this storm stood Manfred, the illegitimate son, the shadow prince, with no claim but every instinct. He didn't seize control, not yet. He offered loyalty. He offered obedience. He bowed to Conrad as regent, ruling Sicily in his name, but Manfred was no servant. Every order he followed was also measured, studied, stored. And every rival that stood in his path met quiet ends, by blade, by rumor, by accident. Whispers began again, that the bastard ruled more than the boy king, that he looked too comfortable in the palace halls, that his hands, though outwardly clean, were always warm, as if recently washed in blood. The Pope took notice. Rome hated Manfred. He was too clever, too silent, too much like his father, a heretic in waiting, a prince from hell. Still Manfred played the part. He danced, he prayed, he smiled, he waited, but the empire was splitting like rotted wood. In 1254, young Conrad, Manfred's half-brother and puppet king, suddenly died. Some said poisoned, others said cursed. Either way, the crown fell, and there was no one left to catch it, except the man who was never supposed to wear it. But to do that, Manfred would first have to kill something even more powerful than a king, doubt. Crowns are not taken in daylight. They are stolen in silence, when the last heir is buried and no one dares speak his name. After Conrad's death, the throne of Sicily became a corpse, still clothed in gold, but already cold. The Pope declared the kingdom vacant, God's property, his to assign. Rome salivated at the chance to erase the Hohenstaufen name from the map. But deep in the Sicilian court, the name had not yet died. Manfred moved slowly, as if mourning, as if lost. He sent condolences. He prayed at empty tombs, and behind closed doors he forged weapons. He knew how the game worked. Legitimacy was a mask, and he had mastered masks. At first he toyed with the idea of installing a fake heir, some distant cousin to act as a puppet. But Sicily was bleeding, and blood didn't wait for ceremony. Nobles were fracturing. The Pope's armies loomed. There was no time left for pretense. And so, in 1258, in a calculated moment of necessity disguised as destiny, Manfred crowned himself King of Sicily. He did not ask permission. He did not offer explanation. He simply stood in Palermo with a sword in one hand, the crown in the other, and placed it on his head with the calm of a man trying on his own coffin. The people didn't cheer, they watched. The nobles didn't kneel, they hesitated. And the church screamed. Within days, the Pope excommunicated Manfred, not once, twice. First as a usurper, then as a heretic. They called him a bastard crowned in sin, a demon in royal robes, but none of it mattered. Because for the first time in his life, Manfred wasn't a shadow, he was the sun, and everything around him began to burn. Yet every fire attracts something older, colder, and infinitely more patient. From across the mountains, in the shadowed corridors of Rome, they began preparing something darker than excommunication, something dressed in armor, speaking French, and baptized in blood. The Church does not forget, and it never forgives a crown it did not place. When word reached Rome that Manfred had dared to anoint himself king without papal blessing, without divine approval, it was not treated as rebellion. It was treated as blasphemy. The Pope didn't just excommunicate him, he marked him, declared him an enemy of God, a serpent in human form, a usurper baptized in bastard blood. And in a Vatican chamber thick with incense and vengeance, the old men of Christ decided not to pray him down, but to burn him down. They needed a sword, a hammer, a man without mercy who could kill without pause and smile without regret. And they found him in France, a cold, calculating noble with royal blood and nothing to lose. Charles of Anjou, younger brother of King Louis IX, devout, brutal, and hungry. He had never ruled anything worth remembering until now. Rome offered him a kingdom wrapped in holy justification. Charles accepted, not for God, but for conquest. The deal was sealed with scripture and steel. A French army would march south, bearing the cross, funded by the Church, blessed by the Pope. But this was no crusade against heathens. It was a holy war against a fellow Christian, and not just any Christian, but a king, Manfred, the crowned heretic, the last Hohenstaufen. Manfred saw it coming. He wasn't naive. He knew what it meant when Rome went silent. He knew what it meant when French envoys began whispering near the Alps. But he did not run. He strengthened his court. He rallied the Sicilian nobility. He forged alliances with Saracens, with Byzantine exiles, with enemies of his enemies. He smiled when he spoke of peace, but he fed the forges day and night. The war had not begun, but the storm had already arrived. And for a moment, it seemed that Manfred, bastard, heretic, self-made king, might just hold it all together. But empires do not crumble in a single blow. They bleed first from within. And Sicily was beginning to rot where no soldier could reach, the hearts of its own lords. Rot rarely shows itself until the structure is already hollow. In the years before the final war, Manfred stood taller than ever. On the surface, his kingdom glimmered, palaces buzzing with art and science, Sicilian courts hosting scholars, poets, physicians, and exiled princes. It was a strange renaissance born from exile and ambition, a mirror of his father's empire. Manfred styled himself not just a king, but a philosopher ruler, a patron of the mind as much as the sword. He wore his crown like a man who had convinced himself he was untouchable, and for a moment it worked. He crushed uprisings, he humiliated a papal invasion, he negotiated with the Greek emperor, married into the nobility of Epirus, tied foreign thrones to his own with blood and promise. His enemies watched, unnerved. The bastard was building something real, something dangerous, but the cracks never left. They only deepened. Behind the tapestries and gold-lined letters, loyalty was rotting. His nobles, many of whom had bent the knee out of fear, not faith, began to whisper. They questioned his blood. They questioned his soul. A king cursed by the Pope, married to a foreign bride, allied with Muslims. Was he even Christian? Was he even legitimate? Manfred knew. He felt the shift like cold air in a sealed room. His smile sharpened. His punishments grew swift, surgical, quiet. Enemies disappeared. Confessions were forced. Spies bled in back alleys. He tightened the crown, but it cut deeper each time. Then came the messages. Charles of Anjou was moving, slowly, strategically, not as a crusader, but as a butcher marking his path. The French army had begun its descent into Italy, not to fight Manfred's army in the open, but to crack Sicily from the inside. Rome had promised Charles the crown, but only if he destroyed it first. And Manfred, for all his brilliance, still believed the island would hold, that the old names would rally, that the crown, his crown, meant more to them than fear. But fear is older than kings, and loyalty, once questioned, begins to starve. So he did what every desperate ruler does when the enemy draws near. He gathered his soldiers. He mounted his horse. He rode out to meet death, not in defense, but in defiance. Not in retreat, but toward the battlefield of Benevento. Kings don't ride to their deaths unless they already know there's nothing left behind them. February 1266. The plains of Benevento groaned beneath cold wind and coming violence. On one side stood Charles of Anjou, his French army armored, disciplined, blessed by Rome, and hungry for holy blood. On the other stood Manfred, outnumbered, surrounded, but unnervingly calm. He wore his crown into the battlefield. Not a helm, not a disguise, a crown, as if daring the world to try and take it. His generals begged him to stay behind. He refused. He believed, or at least pretended to, that victory could still be pulled from fire. But those closest to him saw something else in his eyes that morning, not resolve, not pride, resignation. His army was a patchwork of loyalty, Sicilian nobles, foreign mercenaries, former enemies turned temporary allies. He positioned them with precision, calculated each move like a man playing chess against fate. But fate doesn't play fair, and some of those pieces, especially the German cavalry on his flanks, were already broken. The battle opened with smoke and screaming steel. At first, it held. His forces pushed the French back, and for a moment, it looked like the impossible was happening, the bastard king turning back the holy tide. But then the flanks collapsed. Not from fear, from betrayal. Entire squadrons turned their blades, not against the enemy, against their own. Manfred didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He simply dismounted, removed his royal cloak, and looked to the sky. It is said that in that moment he smiled, not with joy, but with clarity, the kind only the condemned ever know. His guards begged him to flee. He didn't. He stepped forward into the chaos, not to survive, but to vanish on his own terms. And somewhere in the mud and gore, the French recognized him. Surrounded, isolated, breathless, he was hacked down, blade after blade, until his crown fell from his skull and was shattered under a soldier's boot. But the horror didn't end with the killing. It had only just begun, because the victors weren't done with the king, not even in deaths. Death should have been the end, but for Manfred, it was just the first humiliation. His body lay twisted in the mud, pierced, trampled, face unrecognizable beneath layers of blood and dust. Around him, silence, not reverence, not mourning, just the mechanical sound of looting, boots scraping, hands stripping his armor, men searching for signs that this broken corpse was truly the king they had come to destroy. And when they confirmed it, by the fragments of his shattered crown, by the rings on his fingers, by the sword still clutched in stiffening hands, a new order came down. No burial, no rites, no tomb, not even a name on stone. Charles of Anjou declared that the bastard king was to be denied Christian ground, that his soul would have no rest, his memory no honor. His body was thrown like carrion beyond the city walls, buried beneath layers of filth and thrown earth. No priest, no candle, just a mound of dirt pressed down by the weight of contempt. Some say his enemies spat on the grave. Others say it was worse, that the burial was done in secret, at night, not out of pity, but shame. That even those who killed him feared what would rise if he were left to rot in the open. That they heard things, whispers, windless voices, the sound of hooves in empty fields. Years later, when Charles grew paranoid that the ghost of Manfred might rise from the earth, he ordered the body dug up and moved again, deeper, farther, out of reach. They buried him under a riverbank, beneath layers of stone and curse, as if distance from the holy soil could drown the echo of his name. But the echo never stopped. In Sicily, the peasants still whispered of the golden-haired king who never begged, never knelt. And in Rome, some clerics began to question the justice of a church that condemned a man so completely and still couldn't silence him. Yet even in disgrace, Manfred's legacy refused to stay buried. Because what Charles had destroyed was only flesh. The bloodline, cursed or divine, still had one final ember left. A boy, a nephew, a ghost in waiting, and that ember was about to burn. Revenge doesn't always ride on horseback. Sometimes it arrives with the face of a boy who still believes in justice. In the wake of Manfred's obliteration, the church tightened its grip on Sicily. Charles of Anjou ruled with iron cloaked in silk, burning what was left of the Hohenstaufen legacy to ash. But in the north, far from the blood-soaked fields of Benevento, another air stirred. Conradin, Manfred's nephew, last male of the Hohenstaufen line, barely 16, all fire and fantasy, still believed in crowns, still believed in right and wrong, still believed that a name like his meant something. He wasn't ready. He wasn't supposed to be, but he couldn't ignore the screams echoing from the south. He gathered what support he could, a meager army of German knights, loyalists, outcasts, and dreamers, not soldiers of conquest, but of memory. They rode with banners from a dead empire and hope as brittle as parchment. Charles laughed, Rome laughed, but Conradin came anyway, crossed the Alps, called himself King of Sicily. And the people, broken by tyranny and guilt, began to look to him as something more than a prince, a reckoning. For a moment, it worked. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers deserted to his cause. Even the winds seemed to favor him. But Charles was no longer just a man. He was a symbol blessed by popes, paid by kings, sharpened by blood. And when the two armies met at Tagliacozze in 1268, it was not a battle, it was a massacre. Conradin was captured alive, shackled, humiliated, dragged to Naples not as a royal, but as a criminal. His judges didn't look him in the eye. His sentence had already been written long before he drew his first sword. They say he walked to the scaffold calmly, hair golden like Manfred's, lips moving in silent prayer. Some claimed he forgave his executioners. Others said he cursed them with his last breath. But all agreed on one thing: when the blade fell, it killed more than a boy. It killed a bloodline. But bloodlines don't vanish with bone. They linger, in silence, in memory, and sometimes in fire. Because while the Hohenstaufens were gone, what rose in their place was far colder, far crueler. A new order built on betrayal, fear, and the silence of unburied kings. A bloodline can die with a scream, but its absence echoes louder. With Conradin's head severed, the Hohenstaufen name ended not with succession, but with execution. 3 generations of emperors, kings, and challengers to papal authority, erased by the axe, buried without fanfare. The dream of a unified Sicily under an imperial crown was now dust, and in its place stood Charles of Anjou, not a savior, not a king in any divine sense, but a butcher crowned in silence. He ruled not by love nor legacy, but through calculated dread. Sicily bled under his reign. Taxes crippled the people. Churches rang not with prayer, but with decrees. Those who had once served Manfred now served in fear or disappeared altogether. The island became a theater of ghostly performances, royal processions with no soul, victories with no joy. Charles didn't need to inspire. He only needed to erase. He scrubbed the past, burned documents, dismantled the symbols of Hohenstaufen rule. Even whispers of Manfred or Conradin were treated as sedition. Children were taught new histories. Priests delivered sermons that began not with scripture, but with warnings. The Pope smiled from afar. The heretics were gone. The throne was cleansed. But there is something dangerous about unfinished stories. In the alleys of Palermo, mothers still told tales of the Golden King. In mountain villages, old men swore they had seen Manfred ride at dusk. A figure in shadow, never speaking, but always watching. Sicily had been conquered, but it had not surrendered. And Charles, for all his wealth and papal praise, ruled like a man constantly haunted. He changed guards frequently, slept lightly, ordered grave to be dug deeper. Had priests exorcise land where nothing moved. He wore the crown, but it never seemed to fit. Because somewhere in the earth, beneath stone and curse, the ghost of the bastard king still breathed. And death, for a man like Manfred, was never the end. It was only the beginning of his memory. Ghosts don't scream, they wait, and Manfred waited for centuries. History, for a time, obeyed the victors. The papal scrolls declared him damned. The French chronicles reduced him to a footnote. The world moved on, or pretended to. But not everyone forgot. Not completely. In the early 14th century, an Italian poet wandered through visions of the afterlife, writing of sin and salvation, of flames and redemption. And in that vision, the Divine Comedy Dante Alighieri placed Manfred not in hell, as the Church had demanded, but in purgatory, still suffering, still exiled, but not lost. It was a twist no cleric could erase. Dante's pen cut through centuries of silence. His words resurrected the bastard king not as villain, but as man, broken, proud, defiant, kneeling not before priests or kings, but before something older than both, judgment. In that shadowed mountain of purgation, Manfred is described with wounds still open, skull still split, yet eyes full of peace. He admits his sins, he accepts his fate. But his presence there, not in fire, but in waiting, shattered the lie that he had been forgotten. Even in death, Manfred refused to vanish. His image haunted paintings, inspired rebellions, crept into Sicilian folklore, not as a martyr, not as a hero, but as something more dangerous, a memory with teeth. He had no grave, no heirs, no dynasty, but his absence became a kind of presence, one that Charles of Anjou could never silence, one that Rome could never bury, one that time could not quite digest. He was born a mistake, lived as a threat, and died like a ghost. But ghosts, unlike kings, do not decay. They linger, they whisper. And they remind us that crowns may be made of gold, but they shatter like bone. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy is the one no one could finish writing. Manfred died with no anthem, no monument, and no hand to close his eyes. His body was buried like a curse. His name was buried deeper, but the silence that followed him was never peace, it was fear. The kind that lingers in throne rooms and church walls, in the pause before a crown is touched, in the weight that never quite leaves royal blood. He was a king forged in rejection, crowned in defiance, and shattered by those who feared what he represented. Power that did not ask permission, but his story was not the last. Years later, his young nephew Conradin would step into the same fire, riding to reclaim what was lost, only to meet the axe as a boy with a crown in his hand and no one left to carry it. And centuries beyond that, in a different court, another crown would fall, this time from the head of a queen. Anne Boleyn, once adored, once untouchable, left kneeling in a tower, whispering prayers to a god who no longer listened. Their stories are written in the same ink, betrayal, silence, and blood. If you followed Manfred to the end, you step further into the shadows. The boy king, the broken queen, their ends are waiting.